They told him to leave the dying soldiers behind. The Chinese were coming, thousands of them, pouring over the hills in human waves that seemed endless. The American unit was being overrun, and anyone who stayed would either be killed or captured. The chaplain had his orders. Evacuate with the retreating forces. Save yourself. There's nothing more you can do here. But Father Emil Kapaun didn't leave. Instead, this Catholic priest from Kansas did something that would become legend among the survivors. He picked up a rifle, something chaplains were absolutely forbidden to do, and he started shooting. Not at random, not in panic, with precision, covering the medics as they worked on the wounded, buying time for soldiers who couldn't walk to be carried to safety. A man of God, trained to tire souls, now taking lives to protect the men under his care. And here's the part that makes you question everything you think you know about war, faith, and what humans are capable of when pushed to the absolute edge. This wasn't a one-time moment of desperation. What Father Kapaun did on that frozen hill in Korea was just the beginning of a story so extraordinary that even after he was awarded the Medal of Honor decades later, most people still don't know his name. Because what happened next, in the prisoner of war camps, where captured Americans were dying by the dozens every single day, would prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun at all. Let me take you back to November 1950, to a place called Unsan, North Korea, where everything was going catastrophically wrong. The Korean War had started just 5 months earlier, and American forces thought they had it under control. They'd pushed the North Korean army almost all the way to the Chinese border. General Douglas MacArthur was telling everyone the troops would be home by Christmas. The war was practically over. Except nobody had accounted for China entering the war with a force of over 300,000 soldiers. When the Chinese attacked at Unsan, it wasn't like anything the Americans had experienced before. They came at night in massive numbers, using bugles and whistles to coordinate their movements and terrify their enemies. The noise alone was psychological warfare, and they just kept coming. Wave after wave after wave. American units found themselves completely surrounded, cut off from supply lines, fighting an enemy that seemed willing to sacrifice unlimited numbers of soldiers to achieve victory. Father Emil Kapaun was with the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment when the attack hit. Now, you need to understand who this man was before we get to what he did. Emil Kapaun grew up on a farm in Pilsen, Kansas, a tiny Czech community where everyone knew everyone, and faith wasn't just something you did on Sunday, it was woven into every aspect of life. He was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1940, and when World War II broke out, he volunteered to become a chaplain, served in Burma and India, saw combat, saw death, came home when the war ended. He could have stayed home, could have taken a comfortable parish assignment somewhere in Kansas. Instead, when the Korean War started, he volunteered again, specifically requested combat assignment. He was 35 years old, and he deliberately chose to go to war. Why? The soldiers who knew him said he believed that's where he was needed most. That faith meant something different when you were standing in a frozen foxhole wondering if you'd see tomorrow. That's where a chaplain could actually make a difference. So there he was at Unsan when the Chinese attacked. The battle was chaos. Companies were being overrun. Units were scattered. Men were dying faster than the medics could reach them, and in the middle of this hell, Father Kapaun was everywhere, running between foxholes, dragging wounded men to cover, praying with the dying, completely ignoring the bullets that were hitting the ground around him. A lieutenant named Walt Mayo later described watching Kapaun move through the battlefield like he was protected by some invisible shield. Bullets would kick up dirt inches from where he was standing, and he wouldn't even flinch. He'd just keep moving toward whoever needed help. But then the situation got worse. The Chinese broke through the defensive perimeter. The order came to fall back, and that's when Father Kapaun saw the medics, Captain Clarence Anderson and several others, still working on critically wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved quickly. The Chinese were less than 100 yards away and closing fast. This is the moment. This is where he picked up the rifle. Captain Anderson, who survived the war and testified about what he witnessed, said Father Kapaun grabbed an M1 carbine from a wounded soldier and took up a position covering the aid station. He wasn't shooting wildly. He was taking aimed shots, picking targets, providing covering fire with the skill of a trained infantry soldier. Anderson remembered thinking it was surreal, watching a priest with his religious insignia still visible on his uniform, calmly firing at enemy soldiers while medics worked behind him. The thing is, chaplains carrying weapons violated both military regulations and his ordination vows. Priests are not supposed to kill, ever, under any circumstances. That's not a guideline, that's fundamental Catholic doctrine, and Kapaun absolutely knew this. But he also knew that if he didn't buy those medics a few more minutes, the wounded men they were treating would die. So he made a choice that probably tortured him spiritually, but was perfectly clear to him morally. He picked up the weapon, and he used it. How long did he hold that position? Anderson said it felt like forever, but was probably 5 or 6 minutes. Long enough for the medics to finish their emergency work. Long enough for several more wounded men to be evacuated. And then, finally, Kapaun put down the rifle and went back to being a chaplain. Except by then, it was too late to evacuate himself. The Chinese overran the position. Father Kapaun was captured, along with dozens of other Americans. And this is where his story transforms from remarkable to almost unbelievable. Because what Emil Kapaun did as a prisoner of war, without any weapons, without any authority, with nothing but his faith and his absolute refusal to accept that the men around him were disposable. That's what eventually earned him the Medal of Honor. The POW camp where they took him was in a place called Pyeongtaung, along the Yalu River. If you want to understand what hell looks like, that camp is a pretty good reference point. It was November in North Korea, which means temperatures well below freezing. The prisoners had no winter clothing. Most had been captured in their summer uniforms. No adequate shelter, barely any food, no medical supplies, and they were packed into conditions designed to break them psychologically and physically. Men started dying almost immediately. Dysentery, pneumonia, malnutrition, frostbite, injuries that became infected. The Chinese weren't technically executing prisoners, but they also weren't particularly invested in keeping them alive. Their philosophy seemed to be, if you survive, fine. If you don't, that's fine too. In the first few months, men were dying at a rate of 2 or 3 per day, just in Kapaun's section of the camp. The Chinese had rules designed to crush solidarity among the prisoners. You weren't supposed to help each other. You weren't supposed to share food. You were supposed to focus on your own survival and absorb the political indoctrination sessions they ran constantly, trying to convert prisoners to communism. Helping another prisoner could get you thrown in isolation or beaten. Father Kapaun ignored every single one of these rules. He started stealing. Deliberately, systematically stealing. Food from the Chinese supplies. Medicine. Blankets. Anything he could get his hands on that might keep his men alive. He'd sneak out of the barracks at night, break into storage areas, and bring back whatever he could carry. When the guards caught him, and they caught him multiple times, they'd beat him. Then he'd heal up and do it again. A soldier named Bob Wood later said that Kapaun would wash the wounded men who couldn't clean themselves. This matters more than it might sound. In those conditions, basic hygiene was the difference between a wound healing and a wound becoming fatally infected. But it was also humiliating work, dealing with men who'd lost control of their bodily functions, who smelled, who were covered in their own filth. Kapaun did it without hesitation, treating each man with dignity. He'd give away his own food rations. The prisoners got almost nothing, maybe a ball of millet or some watery soup once or twice a day. Nowhere near enough calories to survive, especially in that cold. Kapaun would take his ration and give portions to men who were sicker than him, weaker than him, closer to death than him. He was slowly starving himself to keep others alive a little longer. And he kept conducting services, Catholic Mass, Protestant services, whatever the men needed. The Chinese had forbidden any religious activity. They'd confiscated his religious items. Didn't matter. Kapaun would lead prayers from memory. He'd give sermons. He'd hear confessions. He'd provide communion using smuggled rice instead of communion wafers. Think about what this means psychologically for the other prisoners. They're in hell. They're watching their friends die. They're being told by their captors that America has abandoned them, that nobody cares if they live or die, that they should just give up and accept communist ideology. And there's this priest who absolutely refuses to give up on anyone, who keeps acting like every single life matters, who keeps demonstrating through his actions that there's something worth fighting for beyond just survival. Mike Dow, another survivor, said that Kapaun would deliberately get the men to laugh. He'd tell jokes. He'd organize small competitions or games with whatever materials they could find. He understood that keeping their spirits up, keeping them human, was as important as keeping them physically alive. But here's something the Chinese didn't understand about Emil Kapaun. He was a farm kid from Kansas. He was tougher than he looked. Years of manual labor had given him a physical resilience that lots of city-raised soldiers didn't have. And, more importantly, he had absolutely zero intention of breaking. There's a story that encapsulates who he was. One day, a Chinese officer came to the barracks and pointed at a sick prisoner, saying the man was too weak to be worth feeding anymore and would be taken to what they called the hospital, which was actually just a place where they put people they expected to die, with no care provided. It was essentially a death sentence. Father Kapaun stood up and said, "No." The officer was stunned. Prisoners didn't say no. Kapaun explained that this man was going to recover, that he just needed time, that removing him from the barracks would kill him, the officer insisted. Kapaun physically stood between the officer and the sick soldier and refused to move. The officer could have shot him right there. Instead, maybe out of sheer confusion at this priest's audacity, he left. And the soldier? He survived the war. Kapaun did this multiple times. Just flat out refused to let the Chinese take dying men to the hospital. And somehow, through force of personality or faith or sheer stubbornness, he got away with it more often than not. But his health was deteriorating. You can't give away your food for months on end, expose yourself to extreme cold, exhaust yourself caring for others, and survive indefinitely. By the spring of 1951, Kapaun was developing a blood clot in his leg. Then pneumonia. His body was shutting down. The other prisoners begged him to rest, to focus on his own survival for once. He wouldn't. He kept making his rounds, kept checking on the sick, kept stealing supplies, kept conducting services. Even when he could barely walk, he kept going. In May 1951, the Chinese finally took Father Kapaun to their hospital. Everyone knew what that meant. The prisoners who went to that hospital never came back. It wasn't a place for healing. It was a place to die away from the other prisoners, so the deaths would be less visible, less demoralizing to the survivors. The men in Kapaun's barracks could hear him in the hospital building. He was still praying, still conducting services for the other dying prisoners around him, his voice getting weaker day by day, but still praying. On May 23, 1951, Father Emil Kapaun died. The Chinese said it was pneumonia. The prisoners believed they simply stopped giving him any food or water and let him die. He was 35 years old. He'd been a prisoner for 6 months, and in those 6 months, he'd saved dozens, possibly hundreds of lives through his actions. Here's what happened after he died. The camp changed. Men who'd been holding on partly because of Kapaun's example started giving up. The death rate increased. The survivors later said that his presence had been holding them together in ways they didn't fully realize until he was gone. One man compared it to a tent pole being removed. Suddenly, everything that had been supported by that structure started to collapse. But his influence didn't completely disappear. The men he'd saved, the men he'd cared for, they started doing what he'd done. Sharing food, taking care of the sick, refusing to abandon each other. Kapaun's legacy was teaching them that survival wasn't just about keeping yourself alive. It was about keeping each other alive. And that lesson stuck with the survivors for the rest of their lives. When the war ended and prisoners were finally released in 1953, the men who'd known Father Kapaun came home with stories. They told anyone who would listen about what this priest had done. But for decades, nobody paid much attention. Kapaun got a posthumous Distinguished Service Cross, which is a significant award but not the highest recognition. The men who served with him kept pushing. They wrote letters. They gave testimonies. They argued that what Kapaun had done deserved the Medal of Honor, not for the moment he picked up a rifle, but for the months he spent in that POW camp, essentially waging a one-man war against death and despair. It took until 2013, 62 years after his death, for Father Emil Kapaun to finally receive the Medal of Honor. President Obama presented it to his nephew, since Kapaun had no children of his own. In the ceremony, Obama recounted some of Kapaun's actions and said this priest had essentially lived the values America claims to stand for. But here's the thing that haunts me about this story. Kapaun's body was never recovered. The Chinese said they buried him somewhere near the camp, but they never documented where. Multiple attempts to find his remains have failed. So this man who refused to let anyone be forgotten, who insisted every life had value, who wouldn't abandon a single soldier, his own resting place is unknown. There's a deeper question buried in all of this, and it's one that makes Kapaun's story relevant beyond just military history or religious inspiration. When do you break your own rules? Kapaun was a priest. His entire identity was built around specific doctrines and beliefs, including the absolute prohibition against killing. He violated that, not casually, not without thought, but deliberately when he believed there was no other choice. And then he went right back to living according to those principles, caring for enemy soldiers in the POW camp the same way he cared for Americans. Was he right to pick up that rifle? Catholics are still debating it. Some say he was upholding a higher principle, the protection of innocent life, that superseded the technical rule. Others say there's never an excuse for a priest to kill, that he should have found another way or accepted that some things are beyond our control. But everyone agrees on what he did after. In that POW camp, with no weapons, no authority, no power except his own determination, Kapaun waged the most important battle of his life. Not against the Chinese, against hopelessness, against the idea that some lives aren't worth saving, against the temptation to just focus on your own survival and let everyone else fend for themselves. And he won battles every single day. Not all of them. Men still died despite his efforts. But dozens of prisoners came home who would have died without him. That's not speculation. That's documented fact from the survivors themselves. The soldiers who knew him said something interesting. They said Kapaun never acted like what he was doing was heroic. He'd treat it as completely ordinary. Of course you steal food for starving men. Of course you wash the wounded. Of course you risk punishment to protect the dying. Of course you give away your own rations. What else would you do? He genuinely seemed confused when anyone suggested his actions were extraordinary. Maybe that's the most challenging part of his legacy, because Kapaun's story asks uncomfortable questions. If we were in his position, what would we do? Would we share our food when we're starving? Would we risk our lives for strangers? Would we maintain our principles when breaking them might be easier? Most of us will never face those exact circumstances. We won't be in a POW camp in North Korea, but we face smaller versions of those choices constantly. Do we help the person who's struggling when it's inconvenient? Do we stand up when we see injustice, even if it costs us something? Do we treat people with dignity, even when nobody's watching, and there's no reward for doing so? Kapaun's answer to all of those was yes. Automatically, without calculation or hesitation. And it wasn't because he was some superhuman figure without fear or doubt. The survivors said he was scared. He was in pain. He was exhausted. He knew he was dying. He did it anyway. There's a photograph of Emil Kapaun that was taken before he went to Korea. He's smiling, wearing his priest's collar, looking like someone you'd trust to officiate at your wedding or baptize your kid. He looks kind, gentle, completely ordinary. That's the guy who became a sniper to protect his medics, who stole from armed guards to feed prisoners, who physically blocked Chinese officers from taking dying men, who kept conducting religious services even when it could get him killed. The lesson isn't that we all need to be heroes. The lesson is that heroism isn't some special quality that only rare individuals possess. It's a choice. Usually a choice that has to be made over and over again, in small ways, when you're exhausted and scared, and it would be so much easier to just look after yourself. Kapaun made that choice every single day in that POW camp until his body literally couldn't continue anymore. The men he saved came home. They had families. Those families have children and grandchildren now. There are people alive today, living normal lives, who only exist because a priest from Kansas decided their grandfather or father was worth saving, even at the cost of his own life. That's his monument, not in any cemetery. His grave is still missing, but in the lives that continued because he refused to give up on people when everyone else had written them off. And maybe that's exactly what he would have wanted.